Hello, everybody. This is the March 26th, 2019 SIG Release meeting. The agenda is in the usual place, but I will paste it into the Zoom chat here. As always, I would ask that everybody adhere to the Kubernetes code of conduct and be good people. So, first things first on the agenda. We made a release yesterday. Yay, team. 114 is out there. 115 things now are starting to ramp up. We do have a bug that's come up in the last 24 hours, but we'll get to that a bit later. So the first thing on the agenda is Maria, who is up very late. So we definitely want to get her topic first. So Maria.
Hey, this is conversations that started a couple of weeks back. So some of you may remember that for 113, or just after 113 rather, we separated some of the test jobs that used to make up the master blocking dashboard into master blocking and master informing, the main criteria being how steady they are, how long they take to complete, and how often they are triggered. For a couple of reasons that I'll go into in a moment, the setup for the 114 SIG release dashboards does not follow that of master blocking. So I would like, now that things are a little bit, now that we're past the 114 release, I would like to start on that thread again and move forward with making sure that 114 looks like master, but also any other branch dashboards look like master going forward. So I have put some steps together that I could think of in the document that I've linked in the agenda, which essentially, like my approach would be, let me audit the 114 jobs, see what the overlap is with the ones from master, arrange them into the same kind of dashboards, which is blocking, informing, and upgrade, and then iterate from there. There's a couple of suggestions. One of them is to fold upgrade into blocking and just have one blocking and one informing dashboard per branch. And there are also a couple of questions and I guess blockers that I have at the moment. The main one being that there isn't an exact mapping between jobs that we look at for branch CI compared to master. Some of them are GKE, for example. Some of them just have additional jobs that we don't look at. That we don't have, I guess, equivalent for in master. So my main question at the moment is what you'll think about this. Do you have any advice, any input, any strong opinions on this?
I have all kinds of opinions, but I just shut up.
They're still valid. Go for it.
I'm looking at the document you linked in the notes, and I think I'm largely okay with it. My suggestion would be simplify master first, and then try to work back from that. So I would say let's move all the upgrade jobs into master blocking. And then maybe we can have a conversation about whether those upgrade jobs are actually, or I don't know, I'm sorry, as I'm saying this out loud, maybe we want to have the conversation about whether those upgrade jobs are something that meet the criteria we have laid out for blocking jobs. They take a really long time, they're not scheduled super frequently, and they're incredibly flaky. So you are hearing me decide out loud that perhaps instead we should move all the upgrade jobs to the informing dashboard. Then we only have two dashboards. Blocking, super duper care about, automation can be pointed at it. Informing, nice to know about. And then just copy that for all of the other release branches. I also feel like it would be a really good idea for us to enforce this with some kind of automation or linting tool to make sure that like everything looks the same. You could maybe go as far as like having them be generated by a thing, but I would say just to start with some enforcement of hygiene would be a good idea. We already do this, for example, by saying that if you add a new prow job, it's got to show up somewhere in test grid. so that those test results aren't being sent off to oblivion. I feel like a similar sort of pattern could be used for the release stuff. It's not incredibly related to this, but I also personally have an interest in exploring how we could maybe break up our test grid config into separate files, so that you don't have to get approval from just myself or Michelle anytime you update test grid config, but that instead SIG Release gets ownership of all the SIG Release dashboards. SIG Cluster Lifecycle gets ownership of all the SIG Cluster Lifecycle dashboards, so on and so forth. But I feel like that may be a large enough refactor that I'd rather hold off on that and let you accomplish this. And I'm happy to be super pushy and super aggressive in moving this forward like today, because I don't care anymore, because 114's out the door. So now is the perfect time to start shuffling everything around. But I will, of course, defer to the judgment of the incoming release lead if she has any expectations or requirements about how stable things are with regard to our test grid dashboards, and if there is any deadline by which we should do all that stuff. Opinions over.
I feel like he's thrown that out to you, Claire. Do you have any thoughts?
I trust Maria's suggestion and judgment, and possibly, even though he's not on the line, my future CI signal lead or my current CI signal lead's judgment, being that they're a little bit closer.
I'm on the line and I like Maria's idea.
Okay,
Cool.
so then what I might do is break that down into a couple of initial issues for us to consolidate, like to get clarity on what master will look like. It's probably a better idea to do that sooner rather than later, rather than having something for 114 that we then try to extend to master mid-release. Okay, so I'll go ahead and create a couple of issues for us to chat through what makes it into blogging and what in an informing dashboard for master. I kind of agree with the upgrade jobs not necessarily meeting the criteria to be blocking, but then I am also kind of uncomfortable in terms of that path. How do I put this? Like, the upgrade path is something that we would look at to make a release blocking decision. But yeah, there's probably some work to do there to get them a bit steadier.
Lubomir, you've mentioned that there's probably or possibly some changes planned for the 115 cycle with respect to upgrade from the KubeADM side.
We are still in the planning phase of what to do and what is the best way to do it. I cannot give you a concrete response of how the KubeADM upgrades are going to look like. Possibly somewhere 2 weeks after the so the release is out. Probably 2 weeks after now, we are going to have a plan. We are actually discussing right now in a Google Doc what is the plan. And do you have a separate question related to that?
So I guess I would echo the others. I want to see that we have solid, as we shuffle these things around and we have the difference between things that are in the cluster directory and things that are happening with KubeADM. I want to ensure that we don't lose track of the site, that we need something for ideally meaningful signal on install and upgrade, and that within this variation, it's easy to forget which we're looking at times across the branches or the changes as we shuffle things around.
Well,
So
we
I have a,
yeah, please go ahead.
I was going to ask, is there like a canonical way of doing a cluster upgrade today with KubeADM?
So there is a document that explains how the user should do it, and it's not super clean how to do it, because we have to upgrade the kubelet last, and there are multiple catches in this document. Like if you mess up a step, the cluster is broken, and we can automate this in an upgrade test. But still, every single provider like GKE or AWS, they might do upgrades completely differently in a different topology even.
Yeah, what I'm trying to drive toward here is to kind of go head on at we have a bunch of upgrade tests, but then like cluster lifecycle refuses to support them because they're made of bash and not kubeadm. Okay, fine. But I'm a member of the community who would really like to see there be like a canonical upgrade story. And it doesn't feel very great to hear that, oh, well, it's this like super legacy deprecated thing that only Google supports. And if I can be honest, like Google does not super duper support it. It is not well staffed. I'm pretty sure anybody who's attending this meeting right now knows that. And so we're left with this situation where we have incredibly noisy and possibly ineffective upgrade testing that supposedly nobody really uses this stuff to stand up clusters anyway. I don't know. I'm really confused. So that's why I'm more comfortable at least moving it over to an informing dashboard for now, because I don't think it's anything that we reasonably block on. We actually still had perpetually failing upgrade tests when we cut 114. Let's call it what it is, and let's not make it blocking until it's blocking. That said, I know that kind is super fast, and that maybe with the work that you're doing with kubeadm, we could get something that at least proves that we can move from one version of Kubernetes to another. I just think there are all of these corner cases around making sure, you know, what's the canonical path of upgrading things, first the control plane, then the nodes, or is it the nodes and then the control plane? And when I'm talking about the control plane, what's the order of those components? And then there's also stuff like the horrible bash upgrade tests do this thing where like they'll keep applications running and make sure that they're active and live while an upgrade is happening. So as nodes drop down and come up, like it's still making sure everything's okay. And like standing up kind and quickly bumping it from one version of Kubernetes to another will not solve that. So it kind of comes down to what is the level of coverage that we as a community are comfortable with. I think like how cloud providers choose to run upgrades for their hosted services is totally up to them, and we shouldn't be beholden or blocked on that.
I can quickly respond, like what is the view of a kubeadm cluster in the first place? Like the goal of kubeadm is to be the setup tool, the official setup tool that provides a minimal viable cluster of Kubernetes. And from there, we don't really support cloud providers. We do, but the cloud providers might do something completely different in their products. For instance, to my knowledge, GKE is doing the API server on a separate node, which is it's a control plane component, but it's not on the same node as the scheduler and the controller manager. kubeadm is doing all the three components on the same node, so the control plane is isolated on the node. And we believe that this is the canonical topology. So we want to provide upgrades for that. This is the supported cluster by kubeadm.
Yeah, like I think I want to live in a world where there's a cluster API driven thing, because cluster API is totally open source, and that might represent the open source community cloud agnostic way of standing up a cluster and then upgrading it, exercising that best practice or that best order. We don't quite have that today.
Yeah, the story with the cluster API is that they have a lot of decisions to make still related to how they want the architecture, because the architecture picture there is unclear. And also
Right.
the APIs objects are unclear. The tools that they use to bootstrap clusters are unclear. And I don't see any upgrade tests from cluster API in the 115 cycle.
Correct. Which brings me back to like, so we have a big pile of bash. That's the only thing that's really providing us upgrade signal. It sure would be cool if we could get more people actually helping with that. Or if we as a community could collectively decide we would rather have zero upgrade signal than flaky, barely supported, we're not really sure if anybody uses it this way, upgrade signal. And I don't need to decide that today, and I feel like I've taken us far afield. I just wanted to say that out loud. Sorry.
So
I think this is really good stuff to have out loud. Lumimir, remind me, is upgrade with kubeadm considered an alpha state or beyond that at this point?
It's considered in some sort of a state. So kubeadm upgrades started before the CAP process and before the alpha, beta, gamma, delta stage was established as well. which means
Yeah,
that
I don't believe that part is true. I mean, there's a supported kubeadm upgrade command. I think to your point, Lubomir, there are some differences between how a user sets up a cluster with kubeadm relative to how, for example, a cluster is provisioned internally by Google for GKE. I think to Aaron's point, that those differences, I mean, for the open source project are not necessarily super important. Like for project goodness, whether the Kubernetes is ready to release or not, if there is a kubeadm upgrade, then we should, I believe, and perhaps this is, I think, what you were trying to say, Aaron, we should, as a community, decide that if kubeadm is the center for all of these tools and it has an upgrade command, then a canonical upgrade workflow based on kubeadm is how the Kubernetes project should decide whether one, what the upgrade test should be based on, and two, whether or not the greenness of those tests allow us to release Kubernetes itself or not. So the whole project should release SIG release should be basing our decisions and our architecture for designing the upgrade test so that it's based on kubeadm and an actually supported upgrade workflow, but based on open source rather than either a bunch of bash in the cluster directory or some hypothetical proprietary code that lives someplace else used by a cloud provider. That's correct.
So technically with kubeadm, we don't really want to impose the canonical way to the project. We believe this is the way of creating a topology with like all the components on the single node. So we have some beliefs, but it's not that we want to impose this upgrade and testing scenario to the project.
Well, not for the users, but as a project, we need a opinion as to how to spin up a Kubernetes cluster and how to upgrade that cluster for testing. Or to Aaron's, I guess, straw, non-argument, decide that as a project, we don't care about whether we can upgrade between Kubernetes versions before we release a new version of Kubernetes.
I see. Well, in any case, I think we should start moving away from the pile of bash that is kubep. So my proposal is that for 115 is that we, me and my colleagues in Cluster Lifecycle, we can try to get the upgrade signal working for kubeadm properly. And we can continue keeping, I mean, the upgrades, Aaron has suggested that we should remove them. It really depends on the who can maintain this. From SIG Cluster Lifecycle, we have only Justin Santa Barbara at this point, who is willing to maintain these upgrade tests. And I'm not sure that anyone else is going to agree. So it's probably a SIG release decision that whether he should kick these upgrade tests out of release walking at this point.
Yes, I agree with that. I think you should run your decision by the community to get their feedback or consensus, but that's absolutely what I'm saying. And so in the short term, I'm suggesting call it what it is, put it in an informing dashboard to say, it's nice to have, but we're not going to stop the world if they fail. And then go tell the community what the state of things is. And by the way, I know it's a lot of bash and it's not very friendly, but there is not anything that is Google specific. Like anybody in the community is capable of running these scripts themselves, standing up a cluster the exact same way and doing the same amount of troubleshooting. Like I hear and am sympathetic to the fact if it's like, well, but it requires spending money on Google Cloud. Maybe we can find ways around that. Maybe that's a discussion about how do we have a canonical way of getting this kind of signal without involving a cloud that you have to spend money on. I don't know, but like this is not I'm fully supportive of like no GKE job should ever block a Kubernetes release. Never, ever, ever, because nobody from the community can get in and see the GUI bits of how GKE is made and some of the logs and stuff from GKE. But that is not the case with anything that's stood up with all the horrible piles of bash. You get all the logs, you can SSH into all the nodes, you can see all the things. You are just as capable of troubleshooting these things as folks within Google. It's purely just been a stance that SIG Cluster Lifecycle only wants to support anything that uses kubeadm. They refuse to touch anything that does not use kubeadm. The bash does not use kubeadm, unfortunately. But
Yeah, I mean,
but anyway.
the Coaster API is going to be definitely a project we are going to maintain as well if we get proper testing there. No, I would like to disagree slightly with the fact that the upgrade tests are quite bound to GCE specifics, at least. I see a lot of like ingress objects in there. Basically, there's an upgrade folder inside the test package, you know, and it uses some. There are some diff tests in there that compare resources. We had a failure related to that last time. You know, with the Go problem, we had to bump Go as well. And I looked at the diff, and all the resources in there were Google specific objects, Google specific resources. In Coast Lifecycle, we only have just in Santa Barbara at this point. You know, Robert Bailey moved to another area. He's no longer in the SIG. So we basically only have Justin now. So it's not like a question of we don't want to. We just we don't even know what these objects are because they are Google specifics.
Okay, I think we're in violent agreement because I share that problem as well, and trust that I'm having those discussions in non-publicly recorded mediums. But I feel like I just want to remind everybody that it is something that we can publicly discuss and publicly support out in the open as well. But I feel like I'd like us to get back to the agenda unless.
So if we summarize this to a proposal and kind of time back for Maria, it seems like we're in general agreement to say that upgrade will be simply informing for now, and that we as a community need to decide what the forward path is if we want something for upgrade to be blocking eventually.
Yeah, legit. That's what I think.
Any objections to that?
And Maria, like, if I can be of any help today after this meeting, give me a ping.
Sounds good. Most likely starting tomorrow, though.
Okay.
It sounds good to me as well to just fold it into informing for now. I would like to do that at the same time as reaching clarity on criteria that would make them blocking again. I feel quite uncomfortable with not having coverage for upgrades, or blocking coverage for upgrades, rather.
It's a worry, and I think that discomfort is healthy and good, but as Aaron mentioned, like each of us is a release lead, so going back for quite a while has had to look at that red stuff or the flaky stuff and kind of accept it and wave our hands around it, and we've always gone ahead and released. So we haven't really had a strong signal there anyway. Any other comments on that? Thank you, Maria. So Josh Burkus, you are next on the agenda, Shadows and the 115 release team.
Yeah, so I'm going to try something with the 115 release team based on some conversations we had around selecting the 115 release team. I don't feel, and a couple of other people agree with me, that our apprenticeship, shadow mentorship is universally working. And so my goal for the 115 release team is going to be to try to supervise the shadow selection process and then the sort of shadow training process, as in, you know, are the shadows getting what they need? Are they learning how to do their jobs, etc. To make sure that our, you know, shadow to section lead to release lead sort of promotion thing is working the way that it's supposed to. After this cycle, I'm thinking that this might become, say, the job of the shadow release lead or some other regular position. But for right now, I'm going to do it separately. And as part of that, given that 114 is out, I would like to getting people to apply for shadows immediately. One of the issues we had last time was the shadows didn't get selected for several weeks into there because we were trying to switch to a new system. So I'd like to actually go ahead and get that running right away. Is Stephen on the call?
He said he had a conflict today.
Okay. So I'll bug him on Slack because I'm fine with, I guess one of the questions for Loose Lead is, the one thing I'm indeterminate about is, do we still want to use a form for people to volunteer to be a shadow? I didn't have any problem with the idea. I think it was fine. I just want to go ahead and set up a new one if that's the case.
Yeah, I think I was under the impression we were also going to use the form questionnaire again. At least that's what's been discussed, I think, in the SIG Release Slack channel.
Okay.
Jim Angel is probably the person to ping there as well. I thought he had been involved in improving it. There should be an issue about that somewhere. Looking. Sorry, I did not mean to cut you off, Claire. That was rude.
Oh, it's okay. I was more or less done.
Okay. Anyway, my goal is to get that form up either tomorrow or Thursday. Because we already have people commenting on the issue. So we need to actually give them a place to sign up. So one way or the other, I'll bug Steven and find out if I can get access to the original sign-up form. That was it.
So with respect to the survey form, I think there was a question last time in the survey that says, give me feedback on the survey form. So it's good to go through those answers to see what people wanted there. I'm just an FYI.
Yeah, well, and that's one of the reasons why I need to find Stephen, because I don't have any access to the original form. So.
Could one of you two drop a note in the 114 retrospective about following up on that? Yes, somebody? Anybody?
Yes,
I
can.
All right. So Claire, I wanted to make sure that we had a little bit of time on the agenda for you. Then is there just sort of bucket anything else 115 related that that you want to bring up, you want to mention?
Sure. So we have the release team and the lead shadows finalized and confirmed. I'm starting to put together all of the docs that are needed, and they'll all be in GitHub. And I've sorted out what I think is going to be the preliminary schedule. If y'all are interested in like the high-level details, it would be starting the release on April, or the release process, if that's the right word, on April 8th. Release target date would then be June 24th. And then roughly keeping similar milestones throughout with enhancement freeze and code freeze.
Sounds roughly good to me. Although I feel like I personally have witnessed a lot of people doing PRs and work in the enhancements repo. So I think a lot of planning has already started. But those dates are really useful to call it, like when you're calling the team formed and you're done, you have your team, that's it going forward. And then when you talk about what process changes are you thinking about introducing, when do you want to kind of put a stop to that sort of stuff? I know we're definitely in a period of brainstorming about what we'll want to change or improve based on the retrospective and stuff. But those dates seem legit.
Yeah, and I think for any other changes, I'm kind of waiting to see what comes out of the retro. I know with the KEPs, we'll not change anything about the KEPs, but hopefully make it more clear that having a KEP merged in an implementable state is a requirement is clearer. So we don't need to have the freeze date and then that buffer for KEPs to get to that merged implementable state.
Yeah, I feel like we were pretty clear that was a one-off there, and we can be much clearer about the requirements up front this time.
So thinking about the schedule, I know we have KubeCon in the middle of that. There's a kind of a major long holiday weekend in the US, but the one thing that in the past we've tried to be cognizant of, maybe similar to what Aish did in the fall, was if that fall release slipped, you run into a whole bunch of holidays and complexities, and the same thing happens with the second quarter release and the pending 4th of July and people having perhaps made summer vacation plans around things in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's one to keep in mind that it's important that we hopefully make that date.
Yeah, and just to add to that, per Aaron's recommendation of having releases on Monday, I did set that June 24th is a Monday, so we have roughly 5 days of buffer before we start to get into a very holiday heavy week stateside. So I'm hoping without to allow for the same amount of weeks that we've had in the past, that 5-day buffer is enough.
This reminds me, I was going to put in the retro, don't do Monday releases. I have a complaint, but that's okay. We'll talk about it on Thursday.
Yes. If needed, I could be amenable to putting that on the 25th, which is a Tuesday, and still gives us 4 days. But I will wait till the retro.
Any other 115 questions, comments from anybody else?
So I have walked Claire through, I think, most of the administrivia I had to do up front. I think there's a couple other PRs I still need to do to put Claire in the right owner's files. I'm assuming I should now ask the security mailing list for me to be removed from that mailing list because I'm no longer a release lead. And Claire needs to ask to be added to that. Is that right? Or can I just tell them, roll me off, roll her on sort of deal?
Either way.
Okay.
We're fairly short into having had this process existing anyway, so there's not a lot of precedent there. So next on the agenda, if there's nothing else there, I guess we've already covered this at this point, but 114 retrospective, there's a link there. Drop comments in the doc, and it'll be Thursday at the community meeting. Any questions or comments there?
One thing I tried to do in anticipation was to review everything from the 113 retrospective that we said we'd do. Total coincidence, my name was on most of those items. And many of those were represented as GitHub issues. So I'm kind of going by the issues still open. We're probably still working on it. If it's closed, it's probably not. So I just want to take the time to celebrate, what are the changes we did that worked? And we probably all have a lot on our minds about what we would do differently or whatever, but I think it can be helpful to take some time to reflect on what went well during this release. I say this as a release lead who is in charge of a release that went out the door on time with no crazy last minute cherry picks or anything like that. And yet still feeling oh my God, that was ridiculous. Nothing actually worked. How did we even make it out the door? I'm sure there's actually a lot that went well. So I'm planning on taking the time to reflect on that because it's useful to figure out what's worth keeping around because it worked well.
Yeah, we've already mentioned the CI improvements and cleanups and also KEPs, but yeah, like you said, it went quite smoothly at the end. It was really a lot less stress, I feel like, compared to prior.
Or you.
I mean, I can't get completely inside your head, but I think based on all the signal, you should have been less stressed than some of the prior releases.
It's fair. It's fair.
All right, if there's nothing else there, the final thing on the agenda is the one stress point at this point relative to 114. So we've been talking about improving release engineering for quite a while. And we do have one thing that broke as of the releases yesterday, and it's not necessarily 114 specific. This is a SIG release ongoing issue. So we've got multiple places where we have build scripting and tooling, and the official things for artifacts that we build and release are generated by a Googler and pushed to the web. And now that code is publicly visible, we can see it, but some aspects of this, like the RPM signing and the final pushing to the official repos, others of us can't do. That's still under Google. We have a number of KEPs open around improving artifact generation and consolidating things under the KK repo in its build directory instead of krelease. But this all broke yesterday. And this is the reason I guess this is not 114 specific is we, for reasons that are, well, for reasons, I'll just leave it at that. For reasons, we also produced builds of all the other supported release branches, 111, 112, and 113 yesterday. So all 4 branches were shipped yesterday. And one of the things that was a part of that was an upgrade to the minimum version of CNI that we use. And that's caused a weird hiccup in our RPMs, and we've got a number of people who've complained or noted this both in GitHub issues and on Slack today. And then also, we have a test that caught this. Caleb pointed this out earlier this afternoon. We actually have a test case that caught the problem. Now, it caught it about 24 hours after we introduced it, but that is at least positive that we have a test case that caught the problem. But the current failure there shows the issue that both the Debian packages and the RPM packages on prior builds articulated a desire for the CNI component at version 060, and specifically at that version. And all of the bits for that are out there still, but for some reason, the package managers on both sets of distros are not correctly following that pinning of the version, and they see that there's a newer CNI 075 out there, and they try and pull that in, and there's an unresolvable dependency conflict. So we have 2 options. We could either tell people sorry and use the latest packages because those are the ones that we support and they work, or we could build a new revision of the prior packages. So say like looking at 1.11.6, for example, if you look at its version string, there's also a -0 after it, which refers to the packaging iteration. If we update the package scripting, then that should increment. So you'd have a 1.11.6-1 or something higher. And we could fix this back then. This would mean a whole bunch of building effort for our sole Googler who does all of this building to sort of back populate updated packages that fix this. There are also workarounds. This is sadly a somewhat common breakage in the packaging world, and something that Kubernetes has also done 1 or 2 times before in the last few years. So people can get around this on their command line. It's ugly. It's not great, but I'm curious what people think about what we should do from a support perspective here.
Well, I think there's a third option, I believe, that you didn't mention, which is the yank and publish packages that match the branch as just the general procedure for handling this kind of case. So the reason I would argue that we should remove the previous packages is because they depend on a package with a known vulnerability, meaning we should not offer or advertise these packages as installable by people, given that we know that they should not be installed. And so I think the correct thing to do is to simply remove those packages. One, because you shouldn't install them. Two, because it's easy for an individual, a single person to do. That's a much easier command to execute rather than rebuilding an arbitrary list of packages for each tree of Kubernetes that's still supported, and allows us to move just to it. I guess it assumes that we can roll forward on the patch releases, more or less. I guess whenever we want, but we don't have another process such that I know, or to the best of my knowledge. And it's also not clear to me. So like, I don't know, I've got a VM here now, and certainly I've been able to install previous versions of Kubernetes that take a 0.75 CNI dependency. So certainly, I mean, there are steps you can take as a user, even given the current state of the repository, to perform the upgrade yourself as desired. It's just not necessarily easy, and you may need to download the packages yourself locally. Like you may not be able to rely simply on apt or yum. You may need to use RPM and depackage or some combination of thereof to patch your system. I think that the way that I have suggested makes that, I guess, a little bit more obvious, because you simply would not be able to install older versions of Kubernetes because you would have yanked the packages.
So I'm curious what people think about the idea of removing older artifacts. I feel like that's an uncommon action in the ecosystem, but I understand your rationale for it. And then I wonder what we would tell the, so for example, the user today who is reporting, like, I use 1.11.6 because we have a requirement to use that. We haven't been able to move forward yet in our organization. What do we tell them? Don't use our artifacts? And
well,
and I'm not saying that's bad, because also, like, nobody should be pulling our artifacts from the internet live straight into production.
It's, I guess, kind of my belief, but I mean, if you are, and I think certainly it'll be easier once there's only one location where the package definitions live. So if you had a requirement for some reason that you needed to use exactly Kubernetes 1.11.6, and you also need RPMs, then it's really on you to figure out how to do that. You can build from the source there and figure out how to patch yourself. The project itself, I think our only responsibility is to say that, yeah, we fixed the CNI vulnerability in Kubernetes 1.11.7. That .7 release contains, well, usually only the validation of the bump on the 1.11.6 tree, and you should download the 1.11.7 artifacts moving forward. The previous artifacts have been removed as we no longer have confidence in them, rather than rebuilding them, which I think is strictly the wrong thing to do. Because either you need to bump the revision, and there's no easy way of freight train. There's unfortunately no easy way of saying or checking in the fact that you bumped the revision for a previous version of Kubernetes because of the split between K release and Kubernetes. So it's like, would be more difficult to communicate that fact to posterity if we take the general case or the general stance that we will bump the revision on previously produced artifacts. Today, it will be easy to lose the rationale for why that occurred. I believe it would be easier to yank the artifacts, and when we announce that we've produced, say, Kubernetes 1.11.7, say why we have yanked the previous artifacts when we're announcing the release itself. And for, I guess, prior art, we yank stem cells for Bosch when there are vulnerabilities. I mean, not all the time, because, you know, that's not a problem that happens all the time, but certainly it's something we do for, or have done for serious enough vulnerabilities, because there's just no good reason to allow people to download packages you don't trust. I have never been convinced that there's any good reason for a project, an open source project, to do that.
So do you imagine us, upon releasing a new build for which we have a preference for whatever the ambiguous definition of preference is, that would trigger us to remove all prior artifacts from that particular branch? Or would we only do it when we have a strong reason?
I think when we have a strong reason, loss of trust is I believe in my mind, a canonical example there. And loss of trust in this case because of a dependency with a vulnerability.
And would that be articulated somehow in like a discoverable or machine readable way, so that if, like, it could be encoded in a test, if I'm a user and I'm like, hey, your artifacts are missing, we could go look at a test case and say, no, those are supposed to be missing and here's the commit that references why we flag those as deleted? Or how would that not appear really flaky or weird to a user?
I mean, you could imagine, well, I guess it depends. So like, I mean, if you are a shop that uses CentOS, when there's a new version of CentOS, the last version for most meters just goes away. So if you are an if you're an enterprise, you have already figured out how to deal with that, or, you know, you just have not. So that's, I guess, the prior art there. So that's the extreme case, which I don't think we need to take. I think because we produced there's an email that goes out whenever we produce a release, that if we had to take some of these extreme steps, like removing package, which is no good way of communicating that to the open source project because it's proprietary architecture or infrastructure tools, then you say there that you had to pull previous binary artifacts because of this extraordinary reason. Like, presumably there was a security release that chucked this thing out. I think that is the general process, that, you know, we were releasing this version of Kubernetes due to a vulnerability and a dependency. Please upgrade. We are also taking this unusual step of yanking previously published artifacts because we no longer have confidence in those previously published artifacts. If you care about that, you already have them. If you want to rebuild them yourself, you can go to the source, I think, is a reasonable stance to take, given our current level of staffing and just general familiarity with packaging as a problem.
I feel like I want to agree with Caleb there. But I don't know. It's unclear to me like how many users actually consume Kubernetes via Debians and RPMs. But I kind of personally have the stance that the project's boundary for artifacts stops at the binaries, the tarballs, and the Docker images that we produce. And the packages and stuff sure would be really cool if the people in charge of those distributions actually were responsible for maintaining packages for that stuff. I know it's this really squishy, gooey boundary, but I do think it comes down to who in the community is willing to support this sort of thing. So I think this is a healthy discussion to have to figure out like what are the community expectations, but that needs to be weighed against what resources will the community bring to bear to support this sort of thing. I feel like a good place to have this discussion as we look to not just this particular problem of an external dependency maybe not looking good for us, but potentially all of the external dependencies that Kubernetes has to deal with, and thinking about that from a supportability and a liability perspective. Jordan sent out a great email across SIG Release and testing and architecture and the LTS working group about, you know, what are all these external dependencies and what can we do to maybe reduce our reliance on these, or how should we think about supportability and stuff with all these things in mind. So this feels like a good concrete example to talk about there and have better discussion of generalizing.
I wanted to say that I agree that even if this is not a common practice in the Linux ecosystem to like do changes without revisions, you know, I think we are okay with doing that. And hopefully in the long run, like Aaron is saying, we can completely stop doing packages. This should be the responsibility of the distros. It's just a maintenance burden for us. And it seems that people come to us, but instead we can delegate to the distros.
Yeah, I mean, I've been making this point for the better part of 3 years now, but I mean, people do use these packages. I understand that. I think that we just, yeah, we need to find a way of producing packages today that allows us to not, well, one, keeps us from lying to the users. Two, doesn't, it protects them to the best of our ability. And three is somewhere close to the expected workflow of someone consuming these packages. Like, I agree with the comment in the chat from Jeff that, yeah, there are a bunch of edge cases that we could, in theory, try, or, we're kind of on the hook for validating, but I would like just a general approach to just published from the head of whatever release branch we're working with today, and that's really the best we can do. We can publish release head of the release branches for the current three, and you really shouldn't expect anything else. If the people in the community or in general the distributions want to fill in that gap, I would obviously love for that to be a case, but really, I guess the TLDR there is I wish that more distributions were like Arc. If you go look at their installation instructions for Kubernetes, they just pull from source. So I feel like there's a lot we can do together with the wider community.
Do you think this is something that we should document then? Should we make it a little more clear that these packages are sort of best effort, and that head instance of the build is the preferred one, and that's where we're going to make that best effort to help?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. I mean, you can also just like collect my various me saying that for the last 3 years and just collate them all into one place. Like, yeah, this has always been best effort. And if we were even getting into the business of I don't know, this is just kind of me spitballing, but I've always felt that we should just be producing the full machine image from like a Debian base or a Fedora base, slamming in the binaries and just re-releasing those images, so people can just import them into their cloud provider of choice or whatever, rather than figuring out like overlay, like starting from a clean base, which we can do more easily, rather than just producing the packages and throwing them out into the world. But it's like, I feel like if you were concerned either about running in an air-gapped environment or just general startup time, why would anyone be using packages in this day and age? I mean, I guess perhaps I'm too biased versus how we do our distribution for GCP, but we do a lot of work to just expose the binary or the artifacts you want as things on disk somewhere. So your Docker images are a disk that will be appeared to you, so you don't have to pull them from anywhere. And the packages you need installed, they're already in the image because it's faster.
But we don't have the LTS survey back yet, but I'm willing to bet that some substantial, as in at least a third of our users, are installing via OS packages.
Yeah, but I feel like as a project, it'd be way easier for us to produce. Just take the clean. This is what Canonical produced for Ubuntu, or this is the latest Debian stretch, and we just slam in our changes and then just produce that as the image. And you, as an organization, can consume that as you want, but we can test the images much easier as a full image than as individual packages, I believe. So if we wanted to have the most confidence that this stuff worked, we would do something like that, because it'd be easy to run that through CI rather than packages, which need their own CI basically because nothing else needs to use them.
Jeff, I've seen your hand up for a while.
I mean, I typed it out, but I kind of want to give context. I feel like we don't actually define what an external dependency actually is. And having done release notes and having had to go through the list, it's kind of a widespread. So etc.d is obviously a dependency for us. but I also had to track down what Ruby library an Elasticsearch client is using, because it happens to have already been in the external dependencies for the release notes, and it's in cluster add-ons. But a cluster does not actually depend on this whatsoever. So, yeah.
It should only be the things required to bootstrap the cluster itself. Should be nothing in add-ons, none of the examples, dependencies, don't care. It really should just be, at this point, etcd, CNI, cry tools, and your, I guess, whatever version of the CRI run implementation that we actually went through and tested. So some version of containerd or cryo.
Yep, and I feel like that doc that Jordan has started is really the appropriate place for us to make sure we capture this discussion, because it's got a lot of involvement, or we're trying to get a lot of involvement, cross-cutting across the project. So it's probably a good place for us to be clear.
Yeah, and just to like float an idea, this is, I guess, one of the hopes that I have with projects like the cluster bundle, that we'd be able to start expressing the stuff programmatically, both what binaries were tested together, but what also their configuration was, and all the dependencies that go into spinning up the cluster. But so
yes.
I've got hope, and there's now enough people working on this at enough companies that I think we're going to see some action on it, at least here, which would be great.
I agree. I feel like it also, it's not begs the question. That's actually a very specific fallacy. What am I trying to say? It prompts the question of what are we trying to release here? Is it a core, a kernel? Is it a distribution? What's the set of things that we as a project are taking provenance and liability for versus just really recommending that other distributions include, because it'll go together super well with us. Yeah, bundles are one way of expressing that. Other distributions have other ways of expressing that.
Yeah, I feel like that's really just our requirement, is to publish the specification for what went into CI. And you can do with that what you will.
And we've only got 2 minutes left today, so I don't know that we're going to quite have time to decide whether we're a distro or a kernel. But we could try, I guess, if people want.
I think we are a project that needs to produce a cluster bundle, and we can take things from there, but that's the next incremental step. We need to know what goes into CI before it's supposed to run through CI and compare what popped out of CI to what went in before answering any of these other more important to the user questions.
I'd like to say we're a unikernel, just because.
I wanted to circle back to the first point, which Tim had brought in this release engineering process, was about we have 3+ build options. I think we should bring this up with also the K8s infra working group, because
Okay, so let me stop you right there. What we need are people staffed to work it. I'm super happy for the working group to provide the infrastructure for this stuff to run. I need the people to show up, to write the scripts, own the scripts, maintain the scripts, yada, yada, yada. We are absolutely working on making sure there's a place for all this to live, but we need people to bring it to life in order for it to happen. And there are substantial caps out there written about this.
should we have a extra position in K8's release team, so that every release we have some progress in that area?
This is actually
so I believe
this group here assembled into the SIG release meetings. This is one of the
this is why I created the release engineering subproject. I tried to push you all to create it, because I feel like those are the people who are in charge of building the tools and the infrastructure for accomplishing the release engineering. And K8's Infra, because it is a working group, cannot actually own code. It is the working group's responsibility to find SIGs and subprojects who want to own code. So we are here to help ensure that the release engineering subproject is consistently producing deliverables, and that those deliverables have some place to run and live. So if you're asking if sorry, the release
I was going to say,
engineering
with respect
project.
to the release team specifically, the test info role there, I think should own making sure that the production instance of all of that scripting is running smoothly for the release. That's separate in my mind from developing and iterating and changing, because we wouldn't want to be making massive changes to that right in the middle of the actual release cycle.
It's fair there might be a GUI middle between the release branch manager and the test info role, because maybe one of those should be more about what's going into the branch, but realistically, the release branch manager also has to learn all about the stack that's involved in cutting the release. So we can hash that out, but I feel like it's covered by those two roles.
Yeah, it's going to be the same set of cats who wanna play with those bits probably anyway. So.
Yep.
And
we're up against the end of the meeting, and there should be is working group Kate's infra every week or every other week? Is it tomorrow morning that they meet?
We are bi-weekly, so
Bi-weekly, so it's next week.
We're not tomorrow morning, it's next week. Yeah.
So a good reminder for folks who are interested in writing scripting to show up at that meeting. Well, thanks everybody. I will update the docs with respect to the that packaging issue, and I don't think we will spin new packages based on the discussion.
No, but we may want to yank the old ones.
I think that, for me, that verges on a kept discussion, but yeah, let's carry that discussion forward. Because it's, what are we? Are we a distro? All right, well, thanks everybody.
Happy Tuesday.